connection between complex PTSD and borderline personality disorder. And to do that, I'm going to back up and talk first about complex PTSD descriptively, and particularly about the conditions that create this disorder. So could you go ahead and have this slide? That already shows you the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. So here we have the A criteria for PTSD, which you've already seen. But in the trauma field, some of us began to notice that there was a difference between people who had suffered a single impact trauma, which happened once and then never happened again. It was over. And traumas that went on and on for a long period of time, and particularly those that started early in life. In the field, some people will call them type 1 and type 2 trauma. It seemed clear to me that if you're going to be in a situation where trauma is prolonged and repeated, it means you can't escape. It means something has happened so that the ordinary response, which is to flee after traumatic event, has been prevented to prepare the next one. And indeed, some of the conditions in which prolonged and repeated trauma occur are those of activity. Either, frankly, frank slavery, which still exists in our modern world, torture, concentration camps, political situations in which trauma occurs, human trafficking and prostitution, that is a kind of a middle ground between political and this one better? Yeah. Okay. So, as I was saying, prostitution and trafficking, which you can understand both in political and in more individual terms. Some religious cults also have this aspect of captivity where people are unable to escape. And finally, child abuse and domestic violence, which I'm going to talk about most today. But I want to invite you to think about the similarities here. And if you have the next slide. So think about the fact that the desire to have a slave, someone completely under one's control, has not been abolished just because this country abolished slavery some 150 years ago. The desire is still there, and all you need to do, for example, you go on the internet and you type in something like teens and shame. I'm not actually recommending that you do this because if you do, you'll never get pornography off the computer. But it's right out there with this aspect. Imagery of the most violent sort that involves the fantasy of total control over the person. And the fact that that fantasy is agreeable and being sexually arousing. So again, think about the social conditions. The victim is unable to escape, and in order to create that system of total control, what becomes clear is that the perpetrator uses an array of coercive techniques, of which violence is only one. So that if you're thinking about trauma just in terms of violence, you're missing the complexity of the picture. Next slide. Here's a list of of some of the techniques that are used, and these are worldwide. About that. Could we go back
Sorry.
just a second?
Sorry.
Control of bodily functions, again, they do this in terms of both political violence and in terms of child abuse. The capricious enforcement of petty rules. In the borderline study that I did with Chris Perry, there's a article which I'll tell you a little bit about in a bit. We asked, one of the questions we asked in our semi-structured interview was, who made the rules in your family, and did you consider the rules to be unusually fair? And one of the responses we got, which I'll never forget, was, it never occurred to us to even ask whether the rules were fair. We just tried to obey them because there were so many of them, and they kept changing, and you never knew from one minute to another whether you were going to be punished for something that you didn't even know you did wrong. That, by the way, clearly distinguished even quite extreme corporal punishment that followed rules and was considered usually fair. We didn't make that as abusive. It was the kind of unpredictable violence that was often interspersed with intermittent war. And anybody who's done that in prison psychology knows that if you really want to control your rat or pigeon, a steady diet of punishment doesn't work nearly as well as a steady diet of punishment in which random rewards are interspersed. And so you have people say, you think you were going to really be punished, and nothing would happen, and in fact you take everybody out twice, and then another time for the very same thing you do. So intermittent rewards, isolation, again, in political violence, this is well known that, for example, political prisoners will do things like go on hunger strikes to be able to get a letter from home, because they know that maintaining that connection with some sort of outside world, an alternative view of humanity, is most important. In domestic violence, isolation is key to maintaining the coercive control. And you'll often hear battered women say, well, he didn't want me to see my family, and he didn't want me to go out to work, and he didn't want me to see my friends. And little by little, I broke off all those other ties because he would just get so upset. Similarly, if you think about abused children, for example, it used to be said that incest occurred in families that were, quote-unquote, socially isolated. What's important, which is true, but what's important there to understand is that social isolation doesn't just happen, it's enforced. And again, it's enforced because the perpetrator knows that as long as the victim has other social connections, his control is not going to be complete. Degradation and enforced participation in atrocities. This is, again, how many people read 1984 in school? No, almost everybody, okay. And if you remember, the submission of the hero was not complete until he was put under duress, and under duress said, don't do it to me, do it to my lover, do it to Julia. You'll hear abused kids say, particularly if it started with the oldest girl, I made a bargain with him. He could do anything he wanted to be, but just don't touch my little sister or don't touch my little brother. And then there comes a time when she hears the footsteps coming up the stairs, and she sort of lies very still and hopes that maybe this time he won't come in her room, he'll come in her sister's room. Or the kid who runs away from home, knowing that the young kids are still there and are going to be subjected to abuse. So There's a way in which abused kids are forced ultimately to betray their connections to others, or kids in sex rings who are required to recruit other kids. It's the way that people are ultimately forced to violate their own moral codes that makes people feel utterly degraded and worthless and not worthy of human connections. Just to mention that list of methods comes from Amnesty International's report on torture, and it's a list of methods that was compiled by testimony of torture survivors all over the world. And the point of this list is that these methods are cross-cultural, they're international, they're used because they work. How many people have seen the violence wheel before? This is a graphic that was developed by a battered women's service in Duluth, Michigan. It's used to kind of graphically explain the way that various methods of control are interrelated, and that power and control is the center of the wheel, and all these other methods, isolation, intimidation, coercion, and threats, are spokes in the wheel. The next slide. So that's all I'm going to say about the methods that are used to create a situation of captivity. But I want you to bear those methods in mind when we're talking about the impact, because if you, it's much easier to understand the complicated array of symptoms that I'm going to describe to you if you think about them developing in a relationship of coercive control. So, could we go back just for a sec? Looking at the symptom profile, there's a wide array of symptoms in complex PTSD. One of the ways that we realized it was not that the simple PTSD formulation didn't capture it was that we had such a wide array of symptoms, including medical and physical symptoms, somatization, dissociation, affect dysregulation, and reenactments and revictimization. That was already mentioned a bit by Seth. So I'll go over these four in some detail, if we could have the next slide. Just a list of somatization symptoms, not often paid enough attention, but for example, a lot of our complex PTSD patients don't present initially for psychiatric care. They present over on the medical side with numerous medical complaints that don't necessarily respond to usual medical treatments. One of the good research studies in this area was begun by a gynecologist named Vincent Felitti at Kaiser Permanente, who was seeing all these women with pelvic pain. And they didn't respond. They would get worked up. There was no identifiable source for the pelvic pain. You began to question them about childhood histories and identified sexual abuse as the history, the aspect of the history that seemed to be most closely related to these somatic symptoms. He went on to ask about abuse and other childhood adverse experiences in the whole Kaiser Permanente patient population, and developed what's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study in collaboration with what am I thinking of? It'll come back to me. We'll go on. If we can have the next slide. We'll talk about dissociation. Already Seth mentioned this. I want to start by giving you a drawing that I think captures the experience of dissociation very well. This is a drawing that was given to me very early in my career by a patient. I didn't understand at the time what she was trying to tell me. I think now that what she was trying to tell me was that her head and her body didn't connect very well. If she writes here, heads in the clouds, and if you see these drawings of these they're childlike drawings, aren't they? But here's somebody who I've come to think hears no evil, sees no evil, speaks no evil, that there's a way in which what this person knows and what goes on in the body have been disconnected. Dissociative phenomena have many different aspects. The memory disturbances we already see in simple PTSD, the time loss, blackouts, and amnesias that you see in simple PTSD, the fragmentary autobiographical recall. Oftentimes there's a specific amnesia for the trauma itself that you see in simple PTSD. But with child abuse and some of the more extensive, prolonged and repeated traumas, you'll have whole periods of the person's experience, particularly in childhood, that are not remembered. People will say, I don't have any memories of my childhood before age 14 or 15. That's very unusual. Depersonalization, derealization, people will say, I don't feel as though things are really happening, or certain events didn't really happen to me, or they didn't really happen to me. Passive influence experiences, you'll see that with people who have been in a situation of coercive control, that they continue to feel as though someone is controlling them from an external source. Trance-like states, or and Seth already mentioned alter formation and dissociative identity disorder. That, I think, we're pretty much the consensus is now that you simply don't see that except in people who have been abused in early childhood and school, beginning in early childhood. This is again another drawing from a patient. Oftentimes, if you ask people, well, what did you do when the abuse was going on? And they'll say things like, well, I recited the Lord's Prayer over and over to myself, or there was a little crack on the ceiling or a little nightlight, and I just stared at that, and I went into the ceiling, and then I went up there, and I watched what was happening from up there, and I felt very sorry for that kid on the bed, but it wasn't me. A little bit about dissociative experiences in the normal population. This is a study done with the dissociative experiences scale, which is the most common. It's a 28-item self-report scale. We use it routinely at the Victims of Violence program. It's the most commonly used measure for the extent of dissociative experiences. In the general population, normal scores are 12 or less, and you see that the general population peaks within the normal range. And then this has a very long tail going up into the 50s and 60s. PTSD scores are usually around here. And so are scores in a borderline population. Again, the study I'll describe to you a little bit later that I did with Vanderkolk and Perry, our borderline subjects had mean scores in the mid to high 20s. A score over 30 is considered suggestive of a dissociative disorder. So you'll see, again, the borderline scores suggesting that they're up in the trauma range. May I have the next slide? Affect dysregulation. And here you're going to be moving into familiar territory because there's so much overlap with the criteria for borderline personality disorder. But again, you see this in people who've been tortured. You see this in people who've been in concentration camps. Intense reactivity, inability to soothe oneself or find comfort. Explosive or extremely inhibited anger. Self-harming behaviors. Chronic suicidality. You'll see this all in people who've been subjected to coercive control in the more political dimension of life. And you also see it, of course, in abused kids. This is a result from the adverse childhood experiences study that I mentioned a little bit earlier. Felitti went on, as I described, to ask every patient who came in to medical services at Kaiser Permanente about adverse childhood experiences, and they just scored it as yes, no in a number of dimensions. Any experience of physical abuse, sexual abuse, witnessing domestic violence, having a parent who was mentally ill, a parent who was incarcerated, a parent who was substance abusing. There was one more that I don't remember. And they just looked at, in this case, histories of suicide attempts in people who reported one or more adverse childhood experience. And if you look at the odds ratios here, so the odds ratio would be 1 in people who have never had any abuse at all. And then if you look at this, it looks like an exponential curve, so that people who had 7 or more adverse childhood experiences were 30 times more likely to have made a suicide attempt than people who never had such an experience. And they ended up in their population feeling that adverse childhood experiences basically accounted for most, if not all, of the suicidality in their population. Similarly, they asked about health risk behaviors. And here the odds ratios look more like straight lines rather than exponential curves. But still, as you see, people who had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences were 10 times more likely to smoke, about 7 times more likely to use, to be alcoholic, 2.5 times as likely to report having more than 50 sexual partners, and what this means to me is either extreme sexual compulsivity or use in prostitution, and twice as likely to use injection drugs. So that's a fairly, again, adverse childhood experiences seem to set people up for a pretty grim re-victimization. And if we can have the next slide. It also seems to set people up for re-victimization by other people. There's something about being abused as a kid that seems to interfere with self-protection, or being able to set safe boundaries in relationships. So that this is a study done in London, where, again, people coming into medical offices were asked about their current and childhood experiences of physical and sexual violence. People who were abused as children were twice as likely to get into a domestic violence relationship, 4.5 times as likely to have been in more than one domestic violence relationship, and so on. 3 times as likely to have been raped or sexually assaulted, a little more than twice as likely. And you see there, this is people who've been sexually abused as children, similar odds ratios. So that, there's something about having been in a relationship of coercive control early on that seems to set people up for getting into those relationships again. And the next slide. That's all I'm going to say about the symptom profile. But moving on to the sort of axis 2 symptoms, here what you see are distortions in identity formation, the loss of sustaining beliefs, meaning the beliefs that give people a sense of meaning in life. People who've been through this kind of coercive control will say, I lost my faith in human beings. There's something about having seen this kind of sadism and cruelty up close that does, even hearing about it indirectly, does shake your faith. And so you see that kind of distortion, enormous amounts of shame, guilt, and self-blame, and a sense of defilement or stigma. That there's something about having been in these relationships of degradation and having perhaps participated in acts that violate one's own sense of morality, that make people feel defiled and stigmatized and completely alienated from other human beings. Here's a quote from an incest survivor that I'll never forget. This is someone who described herself as filled with black slime. She described herself as the sewer silt that a snake would breed upon. And if you unpack that image, it contained a very malignant suicide fantasy in which she imagined that she would walk into a river and drown, and her body would turn into mud that would then become the fertilizer for vegetables that her children could then eat. And this was the only way she felt she could be of use to her children. So that she often fantasized that that's how she would kill herself, and that was the way that her children could have something positive from her. Here, I'm going to share a drawing from another patient. This was given to me, as were the other drawings, by the way, with as a survivor's gift to others, as a way of this patient communicating her experience and having it used in teaching. She said, this is the way that something good could come out of my horrible experience. Could we go back? I want to explain this a little bit. This is a board game called Incest City. And Incest City, she describes destruction, ruins, ravage, Holocaust. This is as good a drawing of ego fragmentation as I think you could imagine. And there are various dead-end ways out of incest cities. There's Isle of Addiction, there's Suicidal City, there's Denial Island. and by the way, there's also Lousy Therapy Island, which this was a very sophisticated consumer of mental health services, and she didn't like she didn't like therapists that didn't want to go near the trauma. She felt that that was part of Denial Island. But if you notice this, Incest City is located within the shame-o-sphere and within Isolation C. And I'll talk a bit more about shame and isolation because I think those are so central to the complex trauma experience. This is a quote from Helen Block Lewis, who is one of the early psychoanalytic pioneers in the study of shame. I like to quote from her because I think her work on shame is so useful therapeutically. And also I like to quote her because she's my mother. So I give credit where it's due. But she talks about the self in the eyes of the other as the focus of awareness. And this, I think, is such a useful concept to bear in mind therapeutically because, in my experience, complex trauma survivors are exquisitely sensitive to how they appear in the eyes of others. Next slide. Just a little bit about the links between shame and dissociation. This is a study that was done by Jean and Nancy Talbot at University of Rochester. They looked at inpatients and they used what's called the differential emotions scale to sort out groups that were very high on current feelings of shame. Their control group was a group of patients who had not been abused in childhood. And they used the DES, the Dissociative Experiences Scale that I mentioned to you earlier. And what you see here is that for the people who hadn't been abused, high shame group was higher as a mean score, but they're all within the normal range of under 10. When you come over here to look at the abused women, those who were low on shame, still, the mean is 12. That's still within the normal dissociative range. And I think in the future, this would be a very interesting group to study in terms of resiliency, because here's a group of abused women who were not high on shame. And what was it that enabled them to feel better about themselves? We don't know. But if you look over here, those who were high on shame are way up here in the borderline PTSD, almost to the dissociative disorder range that I mentioned to you before. There's a link there that we don't yet fully understand, but as you see, things are starting to cluster. We have the next slide. This is artwork from Magritte that I think captures the dissociative nature of the shame and captivity experience. Here's somebody again whose head is disconnected from the body, and the body is both caged and naked. So I think that, to me, captures the complexity of the captivity and shame experience. Finally, we'll talk about distortions in relationships. People with complex PTSD, and again, you see this, I want to emphasize, in survivors of political captivity as well as child abuse and domestic violence survivors. Intense, unstable relationships where people both seek connection and then fear it and flee from connection. isolation and withdrawal. You see this in simple PTSD, and you see it compounded in complex PTSD. Persistent distrust, as you might expect after having been in a relationship of coercive control. People will say, you know, I've seen what human beings are capable of, and it isn't pretty. Repeated failures in self-protection. We don't quite understand this, but it's been documented over and over. I already showed you the slide where the re-victimization in childhood abuse survivors was quite substantial. And the repeated search for a rescuer that I think alternates with isolation and withdrawal. And we see this, of course, in our child abuse survivors particularly. So here's follow-up drawing from the the Incest City board game. As you see, it's located within Borderline County. And here's her description of Borderline County. It's located on the intersection of Stigma Street and Stigma Road, and right near Suicide City. In despair, suicidal, go directly to hospital, take one pink paper, she says. And don't forget to blame mother. She's, again, she's, here she says, treatment, over-medicate, neglect, dehumanize, wear down any residual self-esteem. She's somebody, again, who's experienced lousy therapy island, and she's not happy about it. But she's somebody who, the board game has one way out that's not a dead end, and that's going through Pain City to get your survivor diploma. And when you get your survivor diploma, you can go on to Living City. And I'll show you Living City a little further on. So here's the study that I told you about that we did now 20 years ago. And basically, Bessel van der Kolk and I, coming from the trauma field, had both kind of noticed the overlap between complex PTSD and borderline personality disorder, and we had a proposal that we didn't get funded to do a study of childhood trauma histories in people with borderline personality disorder. Luckily, however, Chris Perry, who was then at Cambridge Hospital where I work, had an ongoing study of patients with borderline and near-neighbor personality disorders. And he'd had this study going on for quite some time. It was a prospective longitudinal study. He'd studied people every which way, including having videotaped interviews, and he'd done beautiful work, but he never asked about childhood trauma. And so he agreed to allow us to come in and interview his subjects, and we would be blind to the diagnosis. So we would, so we did this study right, and Chris didn't believe in our hypothesis. He thought that we'd find plenty of childhood trauma in all personality disorders, and that there wouldn't be any specificity for borderline. But when he saw numbers like this coming out of his data set, he was convinced, because what we found was that, and these are Spearman correlations, the correlations of physical abuse, sexual abuse, and witnessing domestic violence in childhood and total trauma with borderline personality were highly specific to the disorder. We saw a little bit of correlation of physical abuse with antisocial personality disorder. The pattern was very different. It tended to be physical abuse more in later childhood and adolescence, whereas with borderline personality disorder, I'll show you in a minute, the correlation was with early childhood abuse. No correlation at all with narcissistic, which actually came as a surprise to me. no correlation with schizotypal, no correlation with bipolar 2, which I didn't show you on this slide, but highly, highly specific. This is in the 0.001 range, 0.01 and 0.001. Could I have the next slide? And just to follow up, if you look at correlation between trauma and self-destructive behavior, the correlations were with early childhood trauma most specifically, then with school age, and not at all with adolescence. So I think we had a very highly, the study is remembered because it's one of the first that documented the connection between childhood trauma and borderline personality disorder. But what I think tends not to be remembered is the highly specific nature of our findings. Chris had never seen numbers like this coming out of his data set, so he became a believer. Finally, I want to say a little bit about distortions in perception of the perpetrator, because I think this is, again, important to bear in mind for treatment, because the shadow of the perpetrator hangs over the treatment, I think, in borderline personality disorder. There is a way in which, having seen up close someone who desired a slave and put into action what was necessary to enslave another human being, seeing that kind of cruelty, oftentimes people will have kind of supernatural beliefs, particularly when it started in early childhood. The perpetrator may often have said things like, "You can never escape me, I will always know what you're thinking, I will always know what you're doing, resistance is useless," and they will tend to have adopted that belief system. If there was sexual abuse, sometimes the belief system is rationalized. This is a very special relationship. The ordinary rules don't apply to us. This is happening to you because you are so special. And so sometimes in religious cults particularly, this is rationalized in terms of a supernatural bond. The very widespread clergy abuse that many of us have read about or experienced, this was often invoked as a kind of supernatural bond. And of course, paradoxical gratitude. If you've had a diet of punishment intermixed with those intermittent rewards, people who are captive become extremely grateful for any little relief, any little gift, and will often feel compromised by the rewards they've received. Sexually abused kids, for example, often got special treatment in the family, and will come to and enjoy the special treatment that they got. Or maybe they were just the ones that didn't get beaten. And they will then feel compromised by that, having accepted those gifts, having accepted the special treatment. That meant that they must have wanted this. The next slide. So what you see in treatment oftentimes is that what's missing is any notion of relationships that can be mutually rewarding, that can be win-win, that can be fair to both parties. Because there was always a relationship of dominance and subordination. What is a relationship of equality like? What is a relationship of mutuality like? That image isn't part of the relational vocabulary, if you will. And what's part of the relationship vocabulary is one can be a perpetrator, one can be a victim, or one can be a rescuer. And those seem to be the options available in the treatment relationship. A lot of the boundary violations that I think are so common with patients with borderline personality disorder begin because the therapist has assumed the role of a rescuer and then feels that all kinds of violations of the therapeutic frame are necessary in order to maintain that rescuer role. May I have the next slide? So that's one implication for treatment. Another implication for treatment, this is a quote from the STEPS group treatment program from University of Iowa. Some of you may have seen the most recent American Journal of Psychiatry, where there's a very interesting report of randomized control study of the STEPS program with very nice results. And their group treatment program, I have to say, reminds me very much of some of the groups that we have at the Victims of Violence program. But they say, in most cases there's a complex interplay between underlying vulnerability and the social environment. This is what you heard from Seth already. Then they go on to say, identifying someone to blame for the disorder is usually counterproductive. Now, I think that's right. Here they're trying to get out of that perpetrator, rescuer, victim triangle. And the fact is that people they're not responsible for what happened to them in childhood, but survivors are responsible for their lives. And therapy only works if the survivor is an active participant and engaging in a relationship of mutuality with caregivers. So I understand why they say that, and yet, they say individuals with BPD don't consciously choose to have this disorder. Of course not. And with rare exceptions, parents and other caregivers do not consciously choose to create an unsupportive childhood environment. Well, I have to take issue with that. I think when you hear the kinds of horrendous stories that we hear from our patients, and by the way, the same horrendous stories we heard in the borderline study that we did not, things that were kind of equivocal for, say, physical abuse, we scored as negative. It had to be extremely violent and result in physical harm to the child before we scored it as abuse. And similarly for sexual abuse, we didn't score things like invitations to watch pornography or exhibitionism or things like that. It had to be a hands-on offense. So I would take issue with the idea that abuse is not consciously chosen, because I think if we don't face the true nature of the horrors that some of our patients have been through, then we're part of denial island. We're not fully accepting the reality of the trauma survivor's world. May I have the next slide? Here's the nonviolence wheel. For some of you who have seen the violence wheel. We use this for psychoeducation. And we talk about, it's amazing how people who've been through horrendous abuse still somewhere have a belief in fairness. They have a sense of fairness. They want relationships to be fair. And so if we believe that this is a good model for relationships of equality, and for therapy relationships, which are not relationships of equality, but can be relationships of mutuality, the same nonviolent methods obtain fairness, non-threatening behavior, respect, trust and support, honesty, shared responsibility. And these are things that we require of our therapists and of our patients. Next slide. Here's Living City, and I want to close with this because I think it gives a message of hope for people who have been through Incest City or things that are comparable. Here's somebody who's worked hard on her recovery, who has experienced some good therapy along with the lousy therapy. And here's Living City, and she, in terms of a good image of ego integration, I think I can't do better than Living City. She describes it as occurring within the holosphere. And here's someone who can use mature defenses, joy of intellect, imagination, humor, arts, crafts, who can love and hate appropriately, who can experience trust and mistrust appropriately, who can experience pain and pleasure, solitude and companionship, abandonment and fellowship, work and play. And I offer you Living City as an image of a place that we would all be happy to live. Thank you.